They accused me of falsifying data on a Thursday morning. No warning, no explanation, just a closed-door meeting, a printed report, and a look from my boss, the kind of look people give when they've already made up their mind. He didn't ask a single question, didn't ask how I pulled the report, didn't ask who touched the pipeline, didn't even ask if I recognized the numbers. He just said, "This looks bad, Eric." I looked at the papers. I saw my name at the top of the dashboard. I saw manipulated values that didn't match any source I'd ever touched. And I saw the signature at the bottom of the page. It wasn't mine. Still, I said nothing. Just nodded once. I understand. That was it. No defense. No begging. I walked out of that building the same way I'd walked in every day for 9 years. Calm, clean, unseen. They thought I was finished. What they didn't know was that the person they'd just fired had built the very foundation they were standing on. My name's Eric Dalton, 41, Data Integrity Lead at Virion Analytics. Or rather, I was, until they chose to believe a rumor whispered by someone who'd never written a single line of production-ready code. They said I'd doctored revenue reports, that I inflated trial conversions to help land a deal with a Fortune 100 client. And instead of asking for logs, or commit history, or even just talking to me like a professional, my boss, Glenn Harmon, fired me based on a printed screenshot and someone else's word. He handed me a release form and a final paycheck. No investigation, no audit, just silence. I didn't argue, didn't ask for details, because I already knew where the real numbers lived. And more importantly, I knew who didn't. They didn't know how the system worked. They didn't know I had built the internal validation layers that caught exactly this kind of manipulation. They didn't know the new junior analyst, Connor, had back-end write access he wasn't supposed to have. And they definitely didn't know that Glenn's golden boy in sales, Darren, had been pushing for inflated projections for weeks. No one knew, except me. So I walked. I went home, poured a drink, and opened the system I'd quietly mirrored to my private environment every Sunday night for the last 4 years. Backups, logs, snapshots, all clean, all legal, all time-stamped. I didn't want revenge. Not then. I wanted truth. And the truth doesn't need volume. It just needs time. 3 weeks. That's how long it took before the cracks they couldn't see turned into a full collapse they couldn't stop. But I'll get to that. First, let me tell you how I made sure every piece of the truth would surface, whether they liked it or not. The first thing I did after leaving Virion was retrieve the weekly data snapshots I'd been storing in cold storage. Encrypted, time-stamped, never altered. Most engineers keep backups to protect themselves from system failure. I kept mine to protect myself from people. The snapshots didn't just include clean data. They included version histories of every script, every dashboard logic change, every user action logged in the system. Not the stuff that ends up in PowerPoint decks. The real guts. Virion's internal architecture was a mess. Patchwork scripts, undocumented API calls, and shortcuts piled on shortcuts. I had quietly built order into that chaos. Scheduled validation layers. Redundant pipelines. Trigger logs no one else bothered to check. So when I looked at the week in question, the same one they accused me of falsifying, I saw something that didn't match. A report titled Q2 Growth Forecast. Final had been exported at 11:47 p.m. on a Saturday night. Only one user was active in the system at that time. Not me. Connor Hayes, junior analyst. 6 months out of school. The kind of guy who wore fake glasses and used phrases like data-driven synergy without understanding a single one. The log showed he duplicated my report, altered the conversion metrics, resaved it under a new file name, then pushed it to the executive dashboard folder. That's the report Glenn had printed in that meeting, the one I was fired over. But Connor wasn't smart enough to erase his tracks. He left the log trail, left his user ID, left every automated validation error message, warnings he overrode manually, and all of it was stored in my snapshot. I didn't reach out to Glenn, didn't threaten Connor. I didn't need to. Instead, I started building a private dossier, each file labeled, each timestamp verified. I documented the access logs, the manipulation flags, the Slack messages Darren had sent pressuring the data team for ambitious numbers before the Q2 board presentation. All of it. I didn't leak anything, didn't whisper to ex-colleagues. I just waited, because I knew something they didn't. The Q2 forecast they showed to the board was based entirely on those falsified metrics. And the board was planning to announce a new funding round based on those numbers. Which meant, if someone, say, a fact-checking analyst at the investor's firm, ran a routine data integrity check, it would all come crashing down. Not because of me, but because truth doesn't need a push. It just needs to be left alone long enough to rise. And Virion had just tied their reputation to a lie with my name stamped on it. I didn't sleep much that weekend. Not out of anxiety, out of anticipation. I'd seen this pattern before. Companies overstate projections, the board gets excited, and someone upstairs starts moving money they don't actually have yet. Except this time, the projections were fake. And I had proof. Still, I didn't move. I didn't leak the logs. Didn't call the board. Didn't try to clear my name through back channels. I'd already seen what their version of justice looked like. They made their decision the moment someone whispered the right lie to the right person. So I let them keep talking. Glenn scheduled an all-hands for Monday morning. I wasn't on the calendar anymore, but a former colleague forwarded the invite to me anyway. The subject line, Q2 Momentum Plus Growth Roadmap. It was happening. They were going to announce the fake numbers as gospel. I brewed coffee, sat at my desk, and opened my tracking folder. I wasn't watching them out of spite. I was documenting impact. The all-hands kicked off at 9 a.m. sharp. A few minutes later, internal comms posted slides to the investor portal. Public-facing metrics. Polished. Overconfident. The Q2 forecast was front and center. 22% projected increase in enterprise conversion rate. I smiled. That was the exact number Connor had fabricated. From there, it was just math. I knew which investors would be watching. I knew which firms had compliance analysts who ran routine integrity checks. And I knew they'd be comparing real trial-to-subscription behavior against those projections within hours. By lunchtime, I got a ping. It was a former senior dev, now working at a compliance firm in Chicago. We hadn't spoken in months. His message was short. Just ran a health check on Virion for a client. Something's off. He didn't ask questions. Didn't need to. I sent him one file. Just one. A screenshot of the system log with Connor's override commands. Timestamped 11:47 p.m. I didn't add commentary. Didn't have to. The log spoke louder than any accusation ever could. He replied a few minutes later. You didn't fake anything. They're screwed. That was the moment it shifted. Not just the facts. The power. It moved back into my hands without me saying a single word. By the end of the day, one of the board firms had requested a data audit. Quietly. Behind closed doors. I wasn't supposed to know that. But I had eyes where it mattered. The same way they had spies who whispered lies. I had people who respected the truth. Because I hadn't burned bridges. I just walked across them. Carefully. And now, the fire was on the other side. I just had to wait for the smoke to reach the top floor. By Wednesday morning, the tone inside Virion had changed. You could see it in the language of their internal memos. What had started as Q2 momentum became early-stage recalibration. And what was once confirmed projections became provisional targets subject to refinement. That's what panic sounds like when it's dressed up for a boardroom. But I wasn't celebrating. Not yet. Because panic is slippery. It doesn't fall in a straight line, it spreads sideways. And when people start realizing the floor under them is made of rotted wood, they don't call the builder. They look for someone to blame. Which meant the people who'd built their lie on my name, Connor, Darren, and Glenn, were about to feel the same silence they once handed me. I got word that Connor had taken a sudden medical leave. Translation, legal told him to disappear before the audit interview. Darren was still posting motivational quotes on LinkedIn like nothing happened. He didn't understand yet. And Glenn? He was quiet. Too quiet. The man who once couldn't send 3 consecutive Slack messages without using a corporate buzzword was now practically invisible. Someone inside the company told me Glenn had called for a code red ops meeting the night before. Locked doors. No phones. Just executives and damage control. But damage control only works when the truth hasn't already been timestamped, archived, and cross-verified by a third-party audit team. The floor was creaking, and they were still dancing. That night, I opened the folder where I kept everything, not just logs, but emails, Slack exports, calendar records, even metadata from shared drives. I wasn't building a case for HR. I was building a system. Not to take revenge, to prevent them from rewriting the story. I had watched too many good people be erased by narratives written after they left the room. So I stayed ahead. I packaged the evidence, encrypted it, and stored it in a private drive with two-factor access. Then I created a single file. PDF. No drama. Just facts. Titled, Timeline of Report Manipulation, Q2 Forecast. Inside, I listed the sequence of events. Timestamps. Access logs. Screenshots. One by one. It was surgical. Because this wasn't an attack. It was a mirror. They built a false story about me. Now, they were going to see what it looked like when the actual story stared back. No shouting. No legal threats. Just quiet facts, placed exactly where they'd be found. Because the truth doesn't need a defense team. It only needs time, structure, and clarity. And Glenn had just run out of all three. The audit landed on a Friday. Quietly. No announcements. No headlines. Just a ripple that started as a whisper and turned into a current beneath the surface. One of the senior partners from the investor group was on site. That never happened unless something was already broken. The audit team didn't start with financials. They started with infrastructure. Smart move. The numbers meant nothing if the system they came from was already compromised. I watched it unfold from a distance, quietly, carefully, like someone watching a building they once lived in catch fire from across the street. The report I had assembled, it surfaced. Not from me. It was forwarded through a compliance back channel. Clean. Untouched. I made sure of that. No notes. No commentary. Just facts, lined up in sequence, like dominoes. At 3:18 p.m., Glenn Harmon was removed from the company's Slack. Not deactivated. Removed. That told me everything I needed to know. They didn't ask for his explanation. They already had the answer. Connor's user logs were presented to the board by the audit team. Every override, every flagged entry, every failed validation, all tied to his credentials. But here's the thing. No junior analyst gets access like that without approval. And guess whose name was on the access grant? Glenn's. His signature. His authorization. His decision to bypass the very controls I built. The moment they saw it in writing, it was over. Darren tried to pivot. Claimed he didn't know the numbers were fake. Said he'd only requested optimistic forecasting. But the Slack messages told a different story. He hadn't requested anything. He demanded it. Aggressively. Repeatedly. I wasn't there to see their faces. Didn't need to be. The silence said enough. Glenn was out. Darren placed on indefinite leave. Connor resigned, with a lawyer's name attached to his exit note. 3 weeks. That's all it took. They destroyed themselves trying to destroy a man who never raised his voice. I got a call that night. One of the senior engineers, someone I trained years ago. He didn't say much. Just this. They're trying to bring someone in to stabilize everything. They asked if I'd contact you. I paused, then said what I'd waited 3 weeks to say. Tell them I'm not interested in rebuilding something they never cared to protect. He was quiet for a beat, then said, Good. We hung up, and I sat there, staring at the screen, the logs, the last few years of quiet structure I'd poured into a company that never deserved it. But I wasn't bitter. I was clean. I didn't get revenge. I let the system speak. And it didn't whisper. It roared. The fallout hit headlines by Monday morning. Not front page, not yet, but loud enough in the right circles. Key executives exit amid internal review at Virion Analytics. Q2 forecasts under scrutiny following data integrity concerns. Soft language. Safe terms. But I could read between the lines. They were trying to contain the blast radius. The board spun the narrative as a realignment. Glenn's name was quietly removed from the leadership page. Darren's LinkedIn switched to open to work. Connor's account vanished altogether. Virion scrambled to show control, but it was too late. The investors were already rechecking Q1. Clients began asking questions. Analysts stopped returning calls. And behind all of it was one undeniable truth. The system had exposed itself. I didn't post anything, didn't gloat, but my inbox lit up. Former colleagues, vendors, even competitors. They all wanted to know what happened. But I didn't tell them, because this wasn't a story to tell. It was a pattern to recognize. This wasn't about me. It never really was. It was about what happens when a company forgets that integrity doesn't show up in profit margins. It shows up in silence. In the people who don't raise their voices, because they're too busy holding the structure together. And when you push those people out, you don't hear the collapse right away. But it's coming. I kept working. Quietly. Took on small consulting contracts. Built leaner systems for companies that understood scale was nothing without trust. One startup CEO I worked with asked me why I left Virion. I said, they mistook silence for weakness. He nodded like he understood, but I knew he didn't. Not yet. Most people don't. Until it's their building that starts to shake. By the end of that quarter, Virion had lost 2 major accounts. A third delayed renewal. The board brought in a crisis consultant and an emergency VP of engineering. I knew her. We'd worked together briefly on a project years ago. She was sharp, calculated, and not the kind of person who took positions she couldn't control. Which meant one thing. She was going to tear everything apart. Not out of spite. Out of necessity. Because you can't rebuild on top of silence that's been broken. You have to clear it to the foundation. And I was the foundation. They just hadn't realized it until they'd already dug me out. Now they were standing on nothing. And the people who stayed behind? They weren't angry. They were afraid. Because they'd seen what happens when the quiet guy stops holding the walls up. And this time, no one was coming to fix it. I still had the last commit I ever pushed to Virion. Dated 4 days before I was fired. A minor optimization to an internal validation script. One no one had noticed for months, but one that kept 1,000 small failures from turning into bigger ones. That commit still lived in the backup I'd archived. Clean, annotated, efficient. The kind of work that doesn't get you applause in meetings, but keeps companies from making headlines for the wrong reasons. It was the last fingerprint I left inside their system. Everything after that wasn't mine. I watched from a distance as the new VP of engineering started pulling up floorboards. She started with the version control logs. She ran file comparisons, found discrepancies, found patches over patches. She followed the chain of changes all the way back to the week they blamed me, and found what I already knew. Connor's name stamped across every edit. Glenn's override approvals. Darren's pressure notes, thinly veiled as strategic alignment. It was all there. She reached out to me through a secure channel. Didn't ask for help. Didn't beg me to come back. She just said, I found what you left behind. It's solid. You knew exactly where the weak points were. I didn't reply, because it wasn't about acknowledgement. It was about architecture. When you build systems with care, even your absence has structure. Even your silence has a fingerprint. Virion tried to erase me, but all they managed to do was reveal how much of the company still ran on the things I built. And how fragile everything became the moment they cut the wrong wire. The new VP began rewriting protocols. She killed access privileges that had been abused. She revoked edit rights to core dashboards. She tore down the front-facing projections and reissued updated forecasts. Smaller, honest, believable. The board hated it. But the remaining engineers, the ones who still had a sense of responsibility, breathed a little easier. Because now, finally, the system was being treated like something more than a shortcut to market value. It was being treated like something real. I didn't need credit. I didn't need a title. I just needed the system to stand again, without lies propping it up. And now it was. Not because of Glenn, not because of apologies, but because somewhere in the wreckage, they'd finally understood. The guy they fired over a rumor was the only one who ever built something that didn't fall when no one was looking. Most people don't notice when the real backbone of a company goes silent. They only notice when things stop working, reports don't run, dashboards throw errors, projections collapse under scrutiny. But the ones who stayed behind at Virion, they knew. They'd seen what happened when the quiet guy disappeared. The interns started whispering about the Dalton layer, this invisible safety net that caught bad data before it reached the surface. It wasn't a myth. It was just a system designed to work best when no one noticed it at all. And now, without it, everything needed a manual check. No more shortcuts. No more late-night edits that slipped through validation. Everything had to be built and checked the hard way. The right way? I wasn't watching with anger. I felt distance. Like watching a city you once lived in start to rebuild after a long winter. The truth had done its job. But not everyone landed clean. Glenn was under quiet legal review. Internal HR marked it as procedural, but a leaked memo confirmed something deeper: executive misconduct, data fraud, and breach of internal controls. He'd gambled everything on one manipulated report. Now he was out of the industry. Connor moved to a different city. Changed his name on LinkedIn. I heard he was working contract jobs, nothing long-term. Darren tried to spin his story into a leadership lesson at a tech conference. But when the organizers found out about the audit, his session was pulled. No statement. No explanation. Just gone. That's how these stories end. Not with a dramatic fall, but with a quiet fade into irrelevance. And me? I didn't chase the spotlight. I kept building. For companies that understood that silence isn't weakness, it's discipline. For teams that valued the ones who spoke in structure, not sound. Sometimes I get offers from people who'd read between the lines. One CEO said, "We want what you built for them, but cleaner." I said, "Then give me clean leadership." He nodded, offered me equity. I declined. I don't want titles anymore. Just terms. Honest ones. Because in the end, I didn't walk away from Virion because they lied. I walked away because they trusted the lie more than they trusted the system that told the truth. And you can't fix that from inside. You have to step out. Watch it break. Let it break. And if there's anything left worth rebuilding, you wait for it to ask, not beg. So when the next system came along, I built it with fewer words, fewer assumptions, more silence. Because the ones who stayed behind at Virion, they didn't need an explanation anymore. They just needed one clean log to remind them what the truth sounds like. There's a moment, after the dust settles, where people expect a return. They think the one who walked away will come back, not because he wants to, but because they assume everyone eventually wants a second chance. But I didn't. Not with Virion. Not with their board. Not with the memory of a room that handed me a rumor and called it justice. When the new leadership quietly reached out with an offer, consulting capacity, advisory only, no direct reports, I didn't hesitate. I declined. Not out of ego, not out of pride, but because I don't patch over broken trust. I rebuild elsewhere. Some lessons can't be taught with training modules. They have to be felt. Felt when projections collapse. Felt when investors stop returning calls. Felt when silence from the one you fired becomes louder than your entire communications team. The only message I ever sent back was 5 words. I wish you clarity. Goodbye. After that, I archived everything. Every log. Every timestamp. Every note. Not to delete it, but to let it rest. Because once the system reveals its truth, you don't have to keep proving it. It stands on its own. I moved on to smaller companies. Startups that weren't bloated with politics. Founders who still touched their own code. People who understood what it means to protect the structure before promoting the spin. One of those startups asked if I could build them a Dalton layer. Their words, not mine. I smiled. Said, "No, I'll build you something better. Something you won't need to name after anyone." That's the goal, really. To make systems so reliable, so clean, so invisible, that no one remembers the builder's name. They just know things don't break. Because real trust doesn't come from presence. It comes from consistency. The system I built at Virion had been silent, anonymous, invisible, just like me. And when they removed it, they didn't know what they were losing until it was already gone. That's the danger of undervaluing quiet people. They don't argue. They don't plead. They just leave. And when they do, the silence that follows is no longer stability. It's absence. And absence is louder than failure. Because failure can be fixed. But absence? That's a warning. One that lingers long after the dashboards are patched and the new names fill the leadership pages. So I stayed gone. Not in bitterness, but in clarity. Some systems aren't meant to be repaired. They're meant to collapse. So something better can be built from the silence up. It's been almost a year. Virion still exists in name. Their homepage talks about renewed vision and next-gen insights. But behind the glossy slogans and investor decks, the heartbeat is different. Quieter. Not the quiet of discipline. The quiet of people tiptoeing through ruins. The new engineers? They're smart. Maybe even brilliant. But they're rebuilding over something they never lived through. And you can feel it. In the way they overdocument. In the way they hesitate to push a change. In the way no one really trusts the system anymore. Not fully. Because systems don't just fail on the screen. They fail in the silence of a room where no one speaks the truth. That's what people never understood about what I built. It wasn't code. It wasn't dashboards. It was stability. It was the idea that if the lights flickered at 2 in the morning, someone, somewhere, had already written the line of defense that would catch it before anyone panicked. It was trust. And you can't rebuild trust with press releases. You rebuild it with time. And a kind of stillness that has nothing to do with fear. The kind that comes from knowing someone is watching the horizon, not just the profit. I work in a small office now. No titles on the door. No investor decks. Just machines that hum quietly, and people who read the logs without waiting for permission. People who understand that the loudest person in the room isn't always the one holding it up. Sometimes it's the one writing in the background. Sometimes it's the one who doesn't explain, doesn't defend, doesn't reply. The one who simply walks away and lets gravity finish what ego started. I didn't burn Virion down. They lit the match when they fired the only person who understood the fire alarms. And now, every time they look at a report, there's a pause. Because they know. They know what the silence means. It's not absence. It's memory. It's structure. It's the shape of something that used to hold them together, quietly, invisibly, until they decided it wasn't loud enough to matter. Now they listen differently. Not because they want to. Because they have to. Because once the system goes quiet, you never forget what happens next. Support the channel by liking, commenting, and subscribing. I promise even more interesting stories.